right, folks, welcome to our second episode of Rot Teahouse, a simple little podcast where Frederick and I, Alex Palma, talk a little bit about a piece of literature, philosophy, or political theory that's caught our eye. Usually something, a little bit out of the mainstream, but something that nonetheless we think contributes to current threads, in our societal discourse or, whatever. Also, part of Rot Teahouse is each episode we feature a different kind of tea. Frederick here is a tea connoisseur, and I, relatively speaking, know nothing about tea. So each episode we try a new tea, and at the end of the episode I reflect on it. So this episode, we are reading The Prison Memoirs of a Japanese Woman by Kaneko Fumiko. These memoirs were written while Kaneko was in prison in Tokyo, facing trial for high treason. This was 1923, 1926. She died in 1926, but she was imprisoned in 1923. She was ordered by the court, it seems, to write these memoirs as a biographical document. That this document would later become the book that we're reading right now, entitled in English, as I said, The Prison Memoirs of a Japanese Woman, but originally titled in Japanese, Why I Did What I Did. So Kaneko and her lover Pak Yol were arrested and accused of scheming to kill the Emperor of Japan. And these memoirs were meant to be a sort of explanatory document that provided background to her life to the court. So in the preface of the memoir, she writes a little explanatory note that says, then the judge ordered me to write something about my past life. It seems that there is a provision in the law that says a defendant should be asked not only about what can be used against one, but about things that may stand in one's favor as well. Perhaps by means of this little used provision, the judge hoped to get at something in my background that might account for my having done such an atrocious thing. Of course, that may not be the reason at all. He may have simply ordered me to do this out of curiosity. It does not matter. I wrote the record of my upbringing as I was told, and this memoir is that account. So Kaneko and Park Yol were arrested in 1923 following a series of earthquakes in Tokyo. The Japanese government had taken advantage of the crisis to quash or attempt to quash a growing Korean independence movement that was sort of blossoming not only in Korea but in mainland Japan. At the time, Korea had been a colony of Japan. Kaneko, who was Japanese but had, as we'll see, lived in Korea for a long time, and Park Yol, who is Korean, were both swept up in the arrests, and their reputation as political radicals led them to face severe charges. This book deals with what women's lives were typically like in post-Meiji Restoration era Japan. The Meiji Restoration followed Commodore Matthew Perry's pressuring Japan into opening up to global trade in 1853. The restoration that followed that meeting of worlds, in this case, refers to the restoration of imperial power. Just prior to Perry's landing, the emperor existed almost entirely as a meaningless figurehead. All real power lied in the shogunate in Japan. However, as Japan formed trade deals with the rest of the world, the power of the shogunate waned, and the emperor rose again as in prominence as the national leader with strong central authority to his backing. In this period, Japan's military and infrastructure modernized. They got rifles and machine guns. They built factories and railroads. However, the country struggled to form a concrete national identity as old power structures fell away. In 1889, the Meiji Constitution was adopted, Importantly for our story, that constitution led to a severe curtailing of women's rights. Miki Sohane, a prominent but now passed on scholar of Japanese history, describes the curtailing of those rights in the preface to these memoirs. He writes, in 1882, the government forbade women from making political speeches. In 1890, it banned them from participating in any political activities or even listening to political speeches. The Civil Code of 1898 gave the head of the extended family virtually absolute authority. The head of the household was given the right to control family property, fix the place of residence of every member of the household, approve or disapprove marriage and divorces, and so on. The wife was treated as a minor under the absolute authority of the household head. End quote. Also massively important to understanding the context of this book is the history of Japanese colonization of Korea. Following the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Japan acquired Korea as a protectorate from Russia as part of the treaty with the Russians. Korea then was formally annexed in 1910, and Japan began to exert colonial control over Korea heavily, exploiting Korean labor and natural resources. Japan lacked the sort of natural resources it needed to quote-unquote modernize rubber, gasoline, etc. So they looked to Korea as a means to acquire those resources. Korean culture was seen as inferior to Japanese culture, and in schools, the Japanese Empire attempted to sort of eradicate or integrate Korean culture from the Koreans. A caste system, a very severe caste system was set up, and essentially Koreans were deemed to be racially inferior to the Japanese. These prejudices carried over to the Japanese mainland as well. Koreans living in Japan were intensely exploited and discriminated against. During this time, the 1920s, as I said before, there was a growing Korean independence movement that had both nationalist and leftist and anarchist formations. And we'll see that Park Yeol specifically is sort of part of the anarchist formation of that. Colonial occupation of Korea wouldn't end until 1945, and after the end of World War II. So there's a lot going on, like as these memoirs are being written, and it's kind of important to understand, like at least that historical context as we go forward, because Kaneko is commenting on and living through a lot of the stuff on the ground. So there's just a little bit of background for you guys. And before we move on, I'm going to call on Frederick here to talk about our tea of this episode, which is Builder's Tea. Take it away, Fred.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for that great summary of the historical context. It's, always necessary to sort of like have that in the background while reading a text like this to sort of like understand the phases of, of Conoco's life. Today we're drinking Builder's Tea. So Builder's Tea isn't so much an actual tea so much as a style of tea. It's popular among the working class in the UK and in some parts of Ireland. Typically drunk or drank by day laborers, builders, carpenters, people doing manual labor. It typically has a strong Assam base. Assam is a type of tea grown in India. It's a black tea. Typically has a very strong, bold, malty, sharp flavor to it. And you can typically find it in breakfast teas like English breakfast, Irish breakfast, and the lesser-known Scottish breakfast tea. So to basically make Builder's Tea, it's quite simple. You're just going to take the amount of tea you would make a normal cup of black tea with, basically double it, and add a small dab of milk and sugar. Very simple. It's a strong tea. It's more or less used among people on shift to keep them awake. When you're out in the raining cold of London, building giant skyscrapers and stuff like that, you should probably stay on your feet. It would be terrible to have an accident. So, if you're thinking about switching to tea throughout the day instead of coffee, Builder's Tea might be a great substitute.
I will say it even kind of looks like coffee. I have a mug of it right now, and it's like the exact same shade of like a coffee with like a splash of milk in it. like even like the sort of opaque look. So yeah, thank you, Fred. We will be sipping on this throughout the episode today, and then we will reflect on both the text and the tea later. A little bit about Kaneko's life. I'm not going to over-explain her biographical sketch too much because that's what the book is about. It's the book, the memoirs are more or less autobiography. But there are a couple things that the memoirs don't touch on that I think are worth bringing up, right? So Kaneko was born in 1903 in Yokohama, Japan. As we'll see, she had an extremely tumultuous childhood, and she bounced around a couple family households. She spent as many as 7 years in occupied Korea living with her grandmother. Kaneko moved to Tokyo as an adult and was exposed both to the Christian group Salvation Army as well as a number of socialist groups. Eventually, she met a woman named Hatsuyo Niyama in college or at night school, and Hatsuyo introduced Kaneko to a bunch of different nihilist and anarchist texts. Stirner, Nietzsche, I think they even read Kropotkin together. And then Kaneko goes on to befriend and fall in love with Pak Yol, Korean independence activist and anarchist. And they together formed a two-person nihilist cell and began to participate in political organizing for a time. And they both contribute to a newspaper that talks a great deal about, the evils of Japanese imperialism, etc. The two, as I mentioned earlier, are arrested. They face trial together, and they're both sentenced to death. Although shortly after their sentences, reduced to life in prison. During this time, during the trials, Kaneko writes these memoirs. Kaneko allegedly kills herself in 1926 in prison. There's some question as to whether or not, whether she actually killed herself. But, she also wrote a number of poems. And if you read the poems, it seems like she's pretty keen on killing herself, just based on the text of those poems. Park Yeol is released from jail in 1946 after World War II and goes back to Korea, where he is eventually captured by the North Korean army in 1950 and has reportedly dies in North Korea in 1974. I don't know if he was in jail. I don't know if he was living there or what. Now, so Kaneko's life and Park Yeol's life is portrayed in at least one film, the 2017 South Korean movie Anarchist from the Colony. I wonder if this book is maybe more prominent in Korea and maybe even Japan than it is here, but it's interesting that a movie was made from it. Yeah, so that's just a short little introduction. Fred, if you would like to summarize the text briefly before we discuss the contents, that would be cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for that biographical sketch.
Yeah.
I mean, being a biographical text, I guess the synopsis more or less just follows what you just said. Conoco was in prison when she wrote this memoir at the order of the court. And the memoir is essentially broken up into three different sections. Her early childhood, her adolescence in Korea, and then her young adulthood leading up to the point where she got arrested with Pak Yeol. So Kaneko was born in Yokohama in 1903, I believe. And she was born into a family of samurai lineage, known as the Saeki family. However, she was not registered to her father. In this period in Japan, you had to register under a certain household in order to attend school, and Kaneko wasn't registered under any household in her early life, which effectively meant, legally speaking, she didn't exist. So she didn't have legal protection. She couldn't go to school. For all intents and purposes, she was nobody's kid. She was nobody. Early on in her life, her father was very supportive. However, he ran off with her mother's sister and ended up taking her younger brother with him. This basically led to her mother and her being more or less transient drifters in Yokohama. Her mother would stay with basically an assortment of men for a period of about 4 to 5 years, taking up different odd jobs. And at one point, she tried to sell off Conoco to a brothel. This wasn't necessarily because she wanted to sell her child into sex work, more so that the brothel actually offered more material security than what she could give Conoco, which, I mean, it's quite tragic, but I mean, given their situation, it's just kind of the sad reality of it. After a while, however, her father's mother in the Iwashita family ended up taking Kaneko to Korea to live with her other aunt on her father's side, who was childless. Around this time in Japan, it was pretty common for people to more or less adopt children in their family if they themselves did not have children. So Kaneko sort of ended up in that situation. In Korea, she got a very minimal level of schooling and was subsequently abused by her grandmother, more or less being forced to do odd jobs around the house, being forced to sit outside for extended periods in the frigid winter, more or less exploited. Here in Korea, Kaneko witnessed the exploitation being done against the indigenous Koreans. And the Japanese, as Alex said in the historical context section, were exploiting the Koreans for their labor and natural resources. The Iwashita family, in which Kaneko stayed with, was quite wealthy. They were very well off, and they didn't even let Kaneko associate with the lower class Japanese, who themselves were also colonizers. This basically led to Kaneko being isolated for about 7 years with very subpar schooling. This only exacerbated once the area in which she lived further industrialized, class sizes got larger, and the already dismal level of education she was getting became even more impersonable, even more dismal, as there were even less resources on the part of the school to be directed towards her. After she completed her schooling and reached the age of 14, it was decided that the Iwashita family would not consider her an heiress, instead considering a closer blood relative more legitimate than her. And Kaneko ended up returning to Japan and ended up returning to the village outside of Yokohama in which her mother was originally from. It was here in which Kaneko started to hang around her uncle, who was a local Buddhist priest at a temple. And she more or less took a liking to the temple and the atmosphere in which her uncle lived with, because understandably, living in a Buddhist temple in the woods, isolated from society, it's going to be relatively peaceful and, free of the torments of everyday life. Her uncle ended up taking a bit of a liking towards her and ended up negotiating with her father to marry her off. This was called off after her uncle discovered that she was seeing a local boy. And, she started to see this Sagawa gentleman, and her uncle was afraid that she was no longer a virgin, which meant that he couldn't marry her. I mean, never mind the fact it was his own niece. But after this marriage fell through, she ended up going to Tokyo. She originally was going to get her uncle to sign an application form to enter an all-boys school. However, after her uncle's desire to marry her fell through, she couldn't get that application, understandably. And it was in Tokyo which she met up with the Salvation Army after getting a short stint selling newspapers. At the Salvation Army, she was exposed to a very Protestant and evangelical form of Christianity, and she sort of drifted between the Salvation Army and local socialist groups, who at the time were hyping up the Russian Revolution. This was about 1917, 1918. Various socialist revolutions were occurring. Even within Korea at this time, you had the Shinmin Autonomous Zone in Manchuria and certain areas of what is today North Korea. So the socialists were a very hotbed group in the imperial capital of Japan. After more or less being transient among different socialists and leftists and living with them and working with them, she came to meet Pak Yol, who, as Alex mentioned before, was a Korean anarchist and independence activist. Pak Yol was, of course, an anarchist and exposed Conoco alongside some other people to our boy Max Stirner, Friedrich Nietzsche, Artsy Bashev, Bakunin, Kropotkin, and a whole host of other anarchist and pseudo-nihilist thinkers. This basically led Conoco into a form of like nihilism or individualist anarchism, egoism, whatever you really want to label it as. And from there, they were arrested after an earthquake in 1923, and they were arrested on pretty flimsy charges of trying to assassinate the Japanese emperor. Of course, the charges were truncated and they were sort of used as a scapegoat to paint leftists as bringing ruin to Japan, not only socially, but physically, as if there was some sort of retribution amongst, against the Japanese people because of the presence of leftists in the capital. And the book sort of ends there, briefly touching on her political views, but mostly covering her early childhood and adolescence in Korea, which more or less formed the overwhelming majority of her life. She only lived to be 23, but also formed the formative periods of which her philosophical and political views, arose from.
Thank you for that, Fred. But it's... Well, I guess we'll get into the discussion of the text now. And I'm just going to start with some first impressions of the book. I was honestly really, really, the sense of tragedy that this book has, that these memoirs have, really, really hits me like a sledgehammer, because it's like, Kaneko was a woman who, despite everything she lived through growing up, almost being sold off multiple times, being starved and beaten by her grandmother and her father, being shipped off to Korea and like sort of living away from home, as a child for so long. I mean, it's almost like fairy tale levels of suffering, right, for a child to endure. And despite that, she has this like incredible lust for life when she moves to Tokyo, even though she bounces from job to job, selling newspapers and working for the Salvation Army and everything. And then, she's just sort of kind of cut down before she can even, not even in her prime, just before she can really even experience like that life she longs for. And it's sad too, because she's so repressed, right? Like, as a woman in Japan in this era, you see in the text that she's like constantly hitting gendered barriers when it comes to jobs, when it becomes to like autonomy and family life, when it comes to her personal relationships. Even with that guy Sagawa, right? At the end of the book, she like ends up leaving him because, she says, hey, if I got pregnant, what would you stand by me? And he says no, basically. And there's no like recourse for her in that situation. So she just like ditches him, and so it's really a story that's like, to me, very tragic, because you have this woman who's hungry for life and who's brilliant, and like has a very strong personality, but she's just quashed.
No, yeah, for sure. And Conoco's life is very much a sort of byproduct of exploitation, poverty, the family as an economic unit instead of, primarily socially supportive one. I think the most tragic part about this is Conoco more or less had one goal in her life. She just essentially wanted to be educated. Mm-hmm. And she had the drive. She had the passion, and no doubt she had the aptitude. She excelled in basically every subject, be it mathematics, calligraphy, classical Chinese, different, social sciences. She was obviously an avid reader of political and philosophical thought. And at each opportunity to finally get an education, it wasn't because of anything that she herself did. It was always because one individual stood in her way of actually obtaining that education, be it her own father failing to register her, her mother's various partners not necessarily holding up their end of the bargain to front the money for Conoco's, elementary education, her grandmother repeatedly sabotaging her by withholding, certain funds and certain equipment necessary for her adolescent education, or even her own uncle sort of mad that she was seeing somebody else, just withholding an application to an all boys school.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
even when she makes it to Tokyo and she's living and working out of the newspaper shop, she talks about how she's so poor and so indebted to the owner of the newspaper that she has to like work feverishly to pay him back. And she talks about how she works so much and she's like not able to make it to school on time, and she like can't afford to keep going to school. And like at night when she's trying to study or trying to sleep, they're like counting the money from the newspaper shop in her room, aren't they? So it's like again and again and again. It's almost like Dickensian, like it's like almost something out of Charles Dickens, and these intense structural and interpersonal barriers for the education that she so wants, like at every turn.
Oh yeah, and I would say it's very indicative of what a lot of people have to go through today. You have a lot of people who either don't necessarily qualify for state aid for university or private education, and don't necessarily have the funds to pay the cost up front, and essentially have to work sometimes full-time jobs while also being full-time students.
Mm-hmm.
And even today with the rising cost of college and really, the opportunities a degree can really afford you today, which are sort of ever decreasing, a lot of people often have to make a very tough decision. Am I going to, keep a roof over my head and eat, or, go to school and get an education? And Conoco repeatedly sort of finds herself in that exact situation. However, it's more so indicative of other people necessarily sabotaging that for her. It wasn't necessarily because like she couldn't accrue the funds. She obviously could, but she also had that extra barrier of people doubting her, not only because she was a woman. I believe her great grandfather said something along the lines of no respectable woman goes to school. So,
Yeah,
she
yeah.
basically had to come up against that sort of gendered glass ceiling. And this really raises the question, too, of like whether or not we can consider Kaneko, a feminist in many ways. And she was exposed to sort of gendered barriers, and she more or less fought to overcome that. And she obviously had a sense of resolute dignity for people just like her, as evidenced by her opinion of, the socialists, how they were preaching stuff that she already implicitly knew.
Mm-hmm.
And it sort of raises the question, well, is Kaneko a feminist? And in many ways, I would argue yes. She has seen like market capitalist failure to sort of retain the family as like a social supportive structure and instead reduce it to a bare bones economic unit, in addition to, these arbitrary barriers placed by a patriarchal society, the Japanese imperial family, the shogunate, basically generations of institutions before her that limited the rights and abilities of women to succeed and become independent. She's sort of dealing with here. I don't know. What do you think about that, Alex?
Well, so it's I'm thinking of two things. So first of all, like the intense emphasis on the family as an economic unit makes it, at least for Kaneko in these memoirs, makes it obvious to me anyway, reading it, that she has no recourse, right? So like if she is in an abusive family environment, she cannot leave, at least not easily, you know? And so like, she switches households a number of times, but that's really only because there's always like somebody in one of the households that she's related to. And it's really not until she's an adult that she's able to like try and make her own way in the world. But like when she does, she has to really bust her ass to make ends meet because and like you said, her great grandfather says, like, why don't you just marry a nice businessman and settle down, right? Like, and get away from all this. But like, that would still trap her in that like that family dynamic. You know what I mean? And I think it's kind of a good parable about how family dynamics are often, in different societies driven by economics, right? So like, that emphasis on the family unit exists, like the family unit like is sort of like partially a biological product, obviously, but also it's intensely a societal and economic product. And we see that kind of playing out like in Cold War era America too. Not to the same level of intensity, but like it's still pretty bad in the sense that like the nuclear family is emphasized. And you see like conservative Christianity, even up until today, emphasizing the family as like the primary unit of like societal interaction, right? And like it kind of reminds me of that dynamic and like how constructed that can be, you know? And like I think one of the reasons that Kaneko becomes a nihilist is because anarcho-nihilist, individualist, whatever, she is so disillusioned with these like constructed communities, like whether it's a family or whether it's a government, she just can't see them acting legitimately on like her behalf or anyone's behalf. So to me, like her trajectory makes perfect sense. And like, yeah. So anyway, that's a bunch of thoughts at the same time. But what do you think, Fred?
No, yeah. I would agree with that. And it sort of goes back to, the constructed community point that you brought up towards the end there. And in many ways, like the place of women in Japan at this time was sort of, very much socially constructed. And Kaneko herself even sort of pointed to the fact that schooling didn't offer the same opportunities to women as it did men. The reason she didn't want to attend, an all-girls school was because they taught things like sewing, cooking, basically home economics, basically what quote-unquote college for women would have been back in like 1940s, 1950s, where instead of, learning the sciences or learning the humanities, you would learn how to properly take care of your husband at the home.
Isn't she even?
So, I mean, even in terms of actually obtaining an opportunity on your own initiative, more often than not, it's just going to lead you back to the same place you came from, albeit with maybe a difference in people. It's still going to be the same form of environment.
Isn't she even briefly in a sewing school and then she quits? I think.
Yeah, I believe so. I believe it was in Korea, or it was before she went to Korea, I believe.
Yeah. And so like, no, I think it's back when she's in Japan because I think she's dating Sagawa and she talks about how she's in sewing school and he's in like some other kind of school. But so anyway, something else that's really interesting about this book or these memoirs to me, these memoirs are not like voluntarily written necessarily, you know what I mean? And I think like looking back, I can really kind of see that. So like, as we said before, these memoirs were written as a court document, essentially. And like, I think one of Kaneko's aims in writing them is that she hoped that her experiences and worldview would influence people later who are reading the memoirs. But like, I think there are a couple times in the text when she mentions that she can't talk at greater length about something that happened because of the restrictions of the court. To me, it's just interesting to think about that because, usually when we read a text, like the author has not full necessarily, but like has a degree of agency over what they're writing. But like to me, here I can only guess what she had to leave out because of the restrictions of the court.
No, yeah. And I mean, while there isn't necessarily a lot of like overt critique in the text, there are a lot of subtle critiques. Like Fumiko recalls, living in Korea with her grandmother, and she more or less gestures at the sort of social hierarchies that are being imposed on the ethnic Koreans there. For instance, the Koreans lived on one side of the settlement. The Japanese lived in a gated community on the other side, which was then segregated by economic class. So I believe that Fumiko recalls a festival of sorts and the Koreans were sort of sequestered to one end of the festival where like the amusements and the food and like the celebratory activities were of like far lesser quality, and the Japanese and their side got all the good stuff, you know, in addition to Japanese industrialists buying raw materials from Korean laborers for sub-market prices, in addition to paying them far less than what they could really afford to use, you know, to keep a roof over their head. And Fumiko sort of gestures at this in a very off the cuff kind of way, sort of like, I'm not going to blow it up as like the main aspect of me living in Korea, but it's definitely a latent aspect and it's in the background. And the reader should take note that this is happening because I'm reflecting on it in my writing.
Yeah.
So I mean, like in the sense, like I don't want to like inherently like I don't want to say that this text inherently lacks a social critique so much as like it can really only get so far. And I think Fumiko sort of finesses her way at like inserting, you know, the critique of like, for instance, the family as an economic unit, which, you know, we just sort of went over, but also the colonization of Korea, not only through her experiences living there as an adolescent, but her interactions with Pak Yol and how, you know, she sort of, I believe they went to a Chinese tea house to sort of really
Very
get to know one
topical.
another.
Yeah.
Yeah, very topical. Kind of runs with our theme here.
Yeah.
But I believe they went to a Chinese tea house and to get to know one another when they first met. And she sort of grills him like, "Are you a part of the Korean nationalist movement? Because if you are, I can't work with you. Not because I don't agree with you, but because I'm not Korean. I don't share your, you know, Korean struggle. Like I can support you, but you know, that's your movement, so to speak." With Fumiko, she sort of acknowledges that, well, not acknowledges so much as recognizes, yeah, like I guess I can insert political critiques here and here and make it appear as though I'm actually writing a memoir when in fact I'm also sort of grilling the people who have me locked up in this cell.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, so it's interesting because, like, you know, you describe that like social critique and description she has of like of colonized Korea, um, but like, you know, for example, I do wonder if she's only allowed to go so far in that critique and description because it's you know, because the court document could itself be censored, but also because like by nature this is supposed to be an individual, like this is supposed to be a document recalling an individual's life, right? And like that recollection is like her defense to the court, right? So like you have to remember like the purpose that this document has. The other thing that you bring up about Pak Yol and Fumiko Kaneko and like whether or not Park Yol is a nationalist or not, you know, it's important to recognize, as I mentioned in the historical note at the beginning, that there was both a leftist and a nationalist formation of the Korean independence movement. And to me, it's interesting to see that dynamic play out in these memoirs because the movements, while they had sort of like a similar impetus in that they were like rebelling against like Japanese imperial rule, it also like reminds me that these like anti-imperialist groups can like rub up against each other and like oppose each other, right? Because I think like we don't like look too closely at how like these anti-imperialist groups work historically, textually, like actually, you know, a lot of times anti-imperialist groups like multiple like in different national situations multiple anti-imperialist groups exist and a lot of times they're fighting against each other. So like, you know, Korea is an excellent example of how you have the anarchists, the socialists, and the nationalists all opposed to Japanese imperialism, and also opposed to each other generally. But also, as Fred and I both know, in the history of Ukraine, there were both Ukrainian nationalists that are fighting against Russian imperialism, and there are Ukrainian anarchists fighting against Russian imperialism. And the two groups were fiercely opposed to one another too. So, I think like a lot of times in like at least leftist discourse, there is a veneration of anti-imperialism as like a general virtue. But like we have to, I think, remember that it's a complicated process in real life.
Right, right. And I mean, oftentimes there's sort of like an intermingling. And I mean, anarchism with its like focus on like localism and, you know, autonomy of a certain geographical area can sometimes rub up against nationalism in a sort of like indirect sort of way, not in the sense that we want to establish an overarching ethno state of sorts, but like it can sort of take the flavor of, well, this people in a general area sort of share a sort of cultural heritage with one another, and that might manifest like you brought up Ukraine, and that's a pretty interesting example because while most people in Nestor Makhno's, Ukrainian Black Army were ethnically Ukrainian, he kept it very multi-ethnic. There were Russians, Jews, Germans, Tatars, all within this Black Army formation in, southeastern Ukraine fighting Ukrainian national government at the time and around the Russian Revolution. And after Makhno had been exiled, he actually lamented that he didn't do enough to really hype up an Ukrainian identity that was juxtaposed to that of the Russian one. He actually lamented that he wrote his memoirs in Russian as opposed to Ukrainian. And not that that's inherently a bad thing, but like, the degree to which it's like a hop, skip, and a jump from like an actual form of nationalism, can be debated at times. And I think with looking back on movements such as whether it's the anarchist in Ukraine, the anarchist in Spain that had a Catalan character that is very much present today. Catalan had that referendum a few years back for independence. Or if you're looking at, the anarchists in Korea that had a very ethnically Korean character to them, the question of whether or not, fighting on behalf of an ethnic group and like their liberation is inherently nationalistic also comes into play here. I mean, Pak Yol, for instance, is often quoted as a nationalist, but at the same time, he's an anarchist and even more so a nihilist. And whether or not he actually would have favored an ethnically homogenous Korean state that, would more or less turn the dynamics of the Japanese back on their head is questionable. When Fumiko asks Pak Yol whether or not he hates the Japanese, he retorts, "No, I don't hate the Japanese. I hate the Japanese ruling class."
Mm-hmm.
And not that every quote unquote nationalist under the sun necessarily hates the other, but, to a certain point, the nationalist program necessitates creating an out group that is not inherently included in the in group, where anarchism has a much broader sort of, well, anarchism in many respects sort of destroys the dynamic between in and out groups itself.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the question of like where anarchism and nationalism mixes in this context is a pretty dodgy one. I think the question in itself is valuable to ask, but at the same time, I think like the question of, does it really matter if there was like a sort of cultural focus of the Korean anarchist movement at this time? I think it's kind of a moot point because obviously the Koreans who are sort of fighting for their liberation against imperialism are obviously going to be Korean, and they're going to have a degree of Koreanness to them that anarchism or not, is more or less going to remain with them.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you so often find these groups adjacent, not necessarily side by side, because like anarchism often, I think, is seen as like against all nations, right? Against all borders, all this stuff. But because anarchism emphasizes decentral solutions to problems, like it's often also inherently localist. And I think that there's overlap there with unfortunately, at least unfortunately from my perspective, with nationalism often. Um, so something else I want to bring up is something that interests me about Fumiko Kaniko's account here, her memoirs, is like the exact flavor of disillusionment that she comes to settle on by the end of the memoirs, right? So, she has this terrible upbringing in early adulthood, absolutely, completely alienated from family life, from society, from any like stable living, cast out. She it basically doesn't exist because of the nature of her birth. And so she's like sort of inclined to be disillusioned with society itself. And then she meets the Salvation Army people and she's, with them for a tiny bit and then again disillusioned. She meets the socialists and she's kind of like lukewarm on the socialists even as she joins with them because to her, what they're saying has been obvious to her most of her life, right? These power dynamics and exploitation is bad, et cetera, et cetera. So to her, like what they're saying is like so painfully obvious that like she's really not that excited by it, right? And eventually she comes to even shun the socialists because I think she says something like, and correct me if I'm wrong, she says, what good is it to replace the system of power that we live under when that revolution would really just bring about a new system of power? Isn't the problem itself authority? And so she slips from socialism into anarchism and then eventually even into nihilism because I feel like she's like very pessimistic about like affecting any actual social change. But nonetheless, as she slips into nihilism, like it's like again a very Stirner-esque nihilism. It's not like this like, oh shit, we're gonna be sad, life sucks, and her life did suck. But like, she's very life affirming, which is something that makes this so tragic. Is that she goes through all this, she like finds herself taking up nihilism and using it as like a means to like affirm her life in this like really screwed up society for her. And yeah, and she a positive turn, right? It's not usually what we think of when it comes to nihilism.
No, yeah, and like in many ways, it's sort of like a proto post left critique of like the socialist movement in a way, right? I mean, Fumiko shares a very similar-esque sort of critique of the socialist movement, much in the same that people like Armand or Stern or the other individualists sort of share. And that quote that like you mentioned prior, but I could not accept socialist thought in its entirety. Socialism seeks to change society, but for the sake of the oppressed masses. But is what it would accomplish truly for their welfare? Socialism would create a social upheaval, quote unquote, for the masses, and the masses would stake their lives in the struggle together with those who had risen up on their behalf. But what would ensuing change mean for them? Power would be in the hands of the leaders, and the order of the new society would be based on that power. The masses would become slaves all over again to that power. What is revolution then but the replacing for one power for another?
Yeah.
I mean, it reads right out of, the Unique and Its Properties, like political liberalism section, or Bakunin's critique of what he referred to as Karl Marx's barracks communism.
Yeah. Well, it has
No,
a
in many
very
ways, like,
has almost an insurrectionary anarchist flavor. Kaneko might find birds of a feather with like crime think today.
oh yeah, like Crime Think, the Invisible Committee, Tikkun, all those sort of insurrectionary groups that, because, it sort of comes back to the constructed community bit, like in a way, like socialism is also a sort of constructed community. It's sort of, even though it's far more inclusive than say like an imperialist colonialist capitalism would be, socialism itself is also imposed on the group of people living there, especially if it's like a state form of socialism, just by means of using power, using authority, using institutions, which might have different objectives and might have different aesthetics from institutions that currently exist, still sort of retain the same functional aspect. And I think with Fumiko, like Fumiko's disillusion sort of leads into like that sort of life affirming nihilism, which I mean raises the question too, to like what extent can we consider this nihilism as we know it? Because if nihilism's the rejection of all values, so to speak, whether it be epistemic, whether it be ethical, whether it just be the rejection of metaphysical or even material claims altogether, Fumiko sort of has a very life-affirming view. She stated to, I believe, the court after writing this memoir that she no longer negates life, therefore she affirms it. She quotes, living is not synonymous with merely having movement. It is moving in accordance with one's will. One could say that with deeds, one begins to really live. Accordingly, when one moves by means of one's own will and leads of the destruction of one's body, this is not a negation of life. It is an affirmation. So I guess in many ways, like Fumiko isn't, I mean, the question of whether or not she can be considered like a full-on nihilist is also up in the air here. Fumiko seems to have a sort of quasi-existentialist bent to her as well,
Mm-hmm.
which
makes sense. I mean, like, Nietzsche and Stirner do kind of like there is a nihilist turn in existentialism, right? Like, I mean, like Camus is sort of like the place where those two movements meet, right? And I mean, I don't think that nihilism and existentialism are necessarily mutually exclusive.
no, yeah. Like that would be fair because like in the sense, existentialism as a project is trying to overcome the problem of nihilism essentially, and most existentialists sort of start at the point of nihilism and try to like claw their way up from its depths.
Mm-hmm.
But
I feel like
I'm
feel like
sorry, go ahead.
no, I mean, I actually am really intrigued that you bring up existentialism because I do feel like that, there could be, and I wish I kind of knew more about existentialism, or at least I wish I had more of it in the forefront of my mind right now, because I feel like that you could definitely do an existentialist reading of this book.
Oh yeah, yeah. Like I think Fumiko's life is what the kids would call a will to power moment.
Yeah.
But I mean, you can take any text and essentially read whatever lens you want into it. Like you can read Fumiko Kaneko's life in a Marxist critique of the family as an economic unit. You can read it as a colonialist sort of first-person view, similar to that of like Heart of Darkness, for example. You can read it as a feminist piece on education. Like, there's a lot of substance here to work with. Like on the face of it, it might just look like a hastily thrown together biography of a prisoner, but I mean, there's a lot of meat and bones to work with. And I think an existentialist viewpoint is one that could be beneficial. Like you could read this next to something like The Rebel by Camus. You can read this in conjunction with like Kierkegaard, but instead of like a leap of faith into Protestant Christianity, it's a leap of faith into education, So
Yeah.
I think you can conjoin this with existentialist writers and sort of glean something out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, to call, Fumiko like a life-denying nihilist, like the sort of stereotype that we all have of nihilism, the sort of which, like, I guess you see like the Jordan Peterson types sort of decry and try to fight against. Like, I think that Fumiko is well beyond that. In a way, she has sort of kind of overcome it in, I guess, her own personalized way.
Yeah. Well, and a huge emphasis of existentialism is this idea that we are always free, right? And like even under the harshest social conditions, like as long as we can make some sort of choice, the act of making that choice like is an affirmation of life and uh, uh, an affirmation of like one's just agency, and that agency like renders meaning unto the self, and that enriches the self, right? So like I feel like you find that in Fumiko's life, in her memoirs. She's so intensely repressed that she sort of just like does stuff to remind herself that she can make choices sometimes, right? So like, for example, she talks about how she like steals rice from her grandmother in Korea, and like she learns how to do it, and like she goes through the process of like, because like her grandmother like draws a symbol on top of the pile of rice like with her finger to like keep anyone from taking her rice, and like she learns how to like replicate that symbol so she can take the rice. And like, she just like she sneaks out with that guy, and like I don't know, like to me, like on the face of it, like these things don't matter that much from like a societal critique point of view, but like from an existential point of view, if you understand her as being this like intensely repressed person who like eventually like comes to terms with nihilism, those actions become intensely meaningful in an existential like framework. Do you know what I mean?
No, yeah. Fumiko lived her life as if she was free in like every moment, like she was, of course, held back from outside factors, the sort of social structure she lived in, the family relatives that she sort of relied on for
Yeah.
her immediate material needs. But I mean,
She she
internally, she was
she
sort of free in the sense that she always aspired past what was in front of her. And, whether it be stealing rice from, her grandmother, or taking what time she could to like socialize with other children when she was, in Korea. She lived life as if like she had to sort of rebel whenever she could.
yeah. She like I think the phrase I was looking for is that she took every advantage that she could scrape out. And to me, it makes that petty shit of like stealing the coins or stealing the rice or like sneaking out with boys. In this context, it makes it intensely meaningful because she did not take life as something that was granted or something that was like a pipeline that she kind of just fell down, right? She was very deliberate. She took her own agency very seriously, and I think that's like something that makes this book, makes these memoirs really really interesting to read through an existentialist lens, through a nihilist lens. So, would you then recommend this book? And if so, Fred, who would you recommend it to?
That's actually a great question. Honestly, like I'm not just saying this because we read it for a recording. Like this honestly probably is one of like the more worthwhile texts I've read in, recently. I think Fumiko Kaneko's work, it's a great insight into a context dealing with poverty, feminist issues, imperialism. And, often in the West, when we read about imperialism, we read about white Western countries doing it to non-white countries that didn't have the same material means to exert power. And this is a pretty interesting firsthand account, I guess for you and I, who are white Western men, of a non-white, non-Western country imperializing another non-white, non-Western country. So, I mean, if you're interested in, feminist theory or imperialist studies or Korea or Japan and their respective histories, I think this is a very insightful book to read. I think it honestly be amiss if you overlooked it. I also think if you're interested in the sort of, same milieu that I guess people like Armand, who we covered in our first episode, or any of the other individualist, nihilist, existentialist writers sort of inhabit, adjacent to that of like leftist and other political movements, I think this book would be a very good read.
Yeah, totally agree with you. And I'm actually going to go a little bit further and just make this book a general recommendation. everybody should read this book, in my personal opinion. If you like fiction, if you like nonfiction, if you like history, if you like politics, if you like Korean history, if you like Japanese history, if you are a feminist, if you like existentialism, if you like just there's so much in this book, and I think that her story is so compelling and heartbreaking that like it's just I find it extremely compelling. Yeah.
Everybody should read this book, and everybody should read all theory.
So that I heartily recommend Fumiko Kaneko's Prison Memoirs of a Japanese Woman. So that being said, I will now move on to my impressions of the tea, Builder's Tea. I have finished it, and I have to say it. So the first thing that I kept coming back to drinking this tea is holy shit, is so strong. Like it's way stronger than even coffee, right? And the milk adds like a lot of body to it too. So it's like creamy, which is not some. I mean, like I don't drink tea that much, so I wasn't really expecting like a creamy flavor to tea. So it's like this strong, creamy flavor. And yeah, I'm glad that we're recording this in the morning because like I feel like I'm going to be very caffeinated today.
Yeah, you ready to build some buildings, Alex?
Yeah, let's go get the bricks. So would I recommend Builder's Tea? I mean, it was also like kind of a fun novelty to make the tea, I will say, because you put 2 tea bags in and like the tea gets like in the cup, it gets like pitch black, right? It's like it's opaque and then it's like coffee colored, right? Like I said before. And so I don't know, it's like a very non-tea tea, even though it does taste like tea. So would I recommend Builder's Tea? Yeah. I also like how it is intensely proletarian, so it appeals to that like to my Marxist side, if you like, in the sense that Fred and I use Twinings, which is a really inexpensive, cheap brand of tea, a very, very shitty brand of tea to make this.
Look, it got me through college. I'll give it that. Like when I couldn't spare the bucks for the loose leaf, I had to make dough. So it has a special place in my heart.
Yeah.
It's like the crate of cheap beer that you get when you can't afford like the good microbrewery stuff. Like you just have to
I
be
love
like,
that cheap
okay,
beer. But
look, like the aesthetics of this podcast is a brick wall and dark academia and just working class consumables.
Like this, like if you can imagine this aesthetic as as if you can imagine this podcast as a room, it's just like an exposed brick studio apartment with no working lights and a pile of like obscure leftist books in a corner. But
that's my dream apartment right there.
No shelves, no bed frame, just a mattress and a pile of theory in the corner. But so yeah, I would recommend Builder's Tea. I actually really liked it. And I think for me, the thing that makes it enjoyable is that like body that the milk gives it. So yeah, let's go build a skyscraper.
I'm glad you liked it. And I'm glad you liked the tea. And I guess for the next episode, I'll have to throw us a curveball for that one. But
we'll
land on something.
I'm in trouble. All right, folks. Well, so that was the Prison Memoirs of a Japanese Woman. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Please join us next time, and together, Fred and I will tackle another text and another type of tea. So, yeah, have a good day. You've been listening to Rot Teahouse with Alex Palma and Fred Gettings. Music by Finley on the Lean. Art by Marta Syrup.